time once again for Community Forum, and we are very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning Margaret Ajemian Ahnert. Margaret Ajemian Ahnert was born in New York City. She received an MFA from Gosher College and a BA from Goddard College, and is a graduate of the Barnes Foundation. She has pursued a variety of careers, including producing television documentaries, running a Pennsylvania hotel and resort, lecturing at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and teaching art appreciation through the Art Goes to School program in elementary schools. And she is here to talk about her new book, The Knock at the Door, A Journey Through the Darkness of the Armenian Genocide. Let's begin. Tell us, what was the motivation in writing your book, The Knock at the Door?
Well, growing up as a little girl, my mother told me stories about her life that really affected mine. And I write in here that fear, like genes, gets handed down. Even though these horrific events did not happen to me, they affected my life. I feared all Turks, like a Turkish cab driver in New York who asked me if I was Armenian, and I denied my heritage. I was terrified. So why was I so afraid of this Turkish cab driver? Because of that, I did a lot of research. I interviewed my mother the last year of her life. She told me the stories, the good stories too, the fun recipes. She has some great tips on how to live to be 98. She lived to be 98, considering what she's survived of. She was in a wagon with dead bodies. She was thrown off a cliff. She was raped and beaten. She survived to be 98, and with an upbeat humor. And feisty, and she was an amazing woman. So all of that is in the book, and it's not all doom and gloom. There's only one chapter of a little beating and torture and bad stuff. The rest of it is kind of amusing. And if anyone has an elderly parent or neighbor, they'll relate to this because the stories are almost the same. I have German people, Jewish people, Irish people saying, "My God, she sounds like my grandmother." And they're fun, and they're upbeat.
All right, so you started hearing these stories as a little girl. Did she go into a lot of detail back then, or was it just kind of...
She would tell me the stories, and they'd be piecemeal. And then when I was 18, I read the book called The 40 Days of Musa Dog, and that sort of turned my life around because there was a Baghratian family in that, and I thought, oh, there was a family she talked about that saved her, and I wondered if they were related. So I did more research. I interviewed her more, and I just tucked everything away until I worked this, I finished this book for my master's thesis at Goucher. And it came into a form of a memoir for my family. But then it got picked up by a publisher, luckily and happily. And it's gotten a lot of buzz, a lot of great reviews, and a lot of attention, some of it not good. I was in New York on May 1st, and I was reading at Barnes & Noble, and I had a former governor of New York in the audience. I had the district attorney of New York in the audience, Bob Morgenthau, and 5 Turks jumped up, shouting and screaming, "Margaret Ahnert, you are a liar. There never was a genocide." Well, that was pretty scary because in Istanbul, just a month before that, they shot an Armenian journalist at point-blank range in Turkey and for talking about the Armenian genocide. It's against the law in Turkey to talk about anything or insult Turkishness. It is a law. There's also a law, as these guys were shouting as the police carried him off to jail. They said, well, we're telling this all here because in France, it's against the law to deny the Armenian genocide, and we can't talk over there. So we're here in America because it's a free country, and we could shout and say anything we want, and we could deny this genocide. I thought, oh, this is good. Our free speech definitely works 2 ways, doesn't it?
So I think your average American wouldn't have ever heard about the Armenian genocide, let alone know where Armenia is.
Well, that's a good question and a good statement, Mike, because I have been on many talks, universities, campuses, and when I ask the question, how many of you have ever heard of the Armenian genocide, maybe 1 or 2 hands go up in a large crowd. So our government ignores it as a genocide. They say, oh, it was just a side effect of World War I. Well, that's not true, because if it was, Why were only the Christian Armenians and Greeks singled out, marched out into the desert, and if they had espoused Muslim and spoke Turkish, they were not killed. They kept their houses and they stayed. So if it was a side effect of the war, everybody would have been pushed out. Only these Christians were singled out.
And it happened during the same time period as World War I?
1915, yes. Yes, it did happen. And yes, there were some effects of the war, I'm sure. But I can only tell you first-person narrative about my mother. And in her case, they were not soldiers. They were not politicians. They were simple farm people living in little houses. And the knock at the door, the title of my book, is what happened. It's one of the titles of a chapter in here. And they literally came and knocked at the door and told them to leave immediately without notice. So if it was effect of the war, it would have been a little bit more organized than that.
So maybe tell us, what were the conditions then that led to this?
Well, I don't claim to be a politician or a historian or a scholar. But whenever people ask me about this and how can I document it, I talk about my mother, what happened to her, what she told me happened to her, and her neighbors. And she lived the last year of her life in an Armenian old age home, and they all would get together and talk about, the stories were all similar. But I can only tell you that. But if you really want documentation and proof that this happened, read Taner Akçam's book called A Shameful Act. Taner is a Turkish historian and scholar. He has documented every event leading up to this genocide, during the genocide, and the aftermath of it. And he has documents to prove it. I don't. That's not my book. But the two books sort of complement one another, I'm told. At least Publishers Weekly said that. They said you need to read both because Margaret's book is a frank and searing testimony, quote unquote, Publishers Weekly. And Taner Akçam's book, A Shameful Act, is a documentation that proves it was a genocide.
So talk about your mom's story. How old was she when this first happened?
My mother, Esther, was 15 when this happened, and she lived a very idyllic, happy life with her neighbors who were Turkish, and they all lived side by side. And one day her brother, who was a soldier in the Turkish army, came to visit and told her and her family that they should leave before they were told to leave, because that would be too late. Well, they didn't listen. They didn't believe. They said, our Turkish neighbors, we get along fine with them. Nothing's going to happen to us. So her brother, Hadertun, told her a story that he knew. And he said it was in the neighboring town, and a Turkish neighbor said to his Armenian neighbor, you know, you and I have been friends for several decades. Your wife and my wife are best friends. Your children play with my children. I promise you, my friend, because you are my friend, I will sharpen and hone my knives so that when the word comes, you and your family will feel no pain. He did that as an act of friendship. Can you imagine that? It was just unbelievable to me. And of course, if you're living next door to your neighbor for a couple of generations, you don't believe it. They didn't believe it, and they waited, and then it was too late. Then came the knock at the door, and they were forced out into the desert. Many died. My mother was raped and beaten and sexually abused and forcefully married to a Turk and survived. Came to this country, escaped, came to this country under a false passport with the name Margaret. That's how I got my name, Margaret. But she came here and she lived, never looked back, never had anger, sometimes fear. Sometimes I could see she felt uncomfortable. I took her to Armenia on a trip, and suddenly my little ethnic mother was speaking nothing but English. We ordered tea, and the lady asked her in Armenian, would you like cream and sugar or lemon? And my mother, in her perfect, finest English, said, I prefer cream and sugar, thank you. And I had to interpret to this little lady who doesn't speak anything but Armenian, the woman who brought the tea. And I said to my mother, what's that about? I spoke Armenian the whole trip. She spoke English. I think. She said, oh, I don't know. It just comes easier to me. I think she was scared. I think she didn't really know she's in Armenia. Is that part of Turkey still? You know, she's still a little ethnic lady. She knew about her own life in America. She's years later returning. I think she was a little afraid. So she spoke English and I spoke Armenian the whole trip. It's a very amazing experience for me.
What has been the Turkish government's response to the genocide? They certainly didn't acknowledge it then.
No, they didn't acknowledge it then. They don't acknowledge it today. They say it was a byproduct of World War I, and they deny that it was a deliberate genocide. But Taner's book proves that it was a deliberate, mechanically and strategically arranged genocide. In 1939, someone questioned Hitler, and they said, you won't get away with taking all the Polish women and children off and killing them. The world will not sit back and watch you. And Hitler's reply was, who today remembers the Armenians? And in Washington, D.C., in the Holocaust Museum, there's a huge, huge plaque with those words emblazoned on it. It's amazing. So Robert Morgenthau, who was the district attorney and grandson of Henry Morgenthau, who was the American ambassador in 1915, gave me a blurb, and he said, I don't give blurbs, Margaret. I'm an elected official. And I said, that's fine. Just, read the book. Well, 3 weeks later, he called me up, and he said, this is the finest first-person narrative I've ever read on the subject, and I've read a lot of them. I want my name on this book. So he gave me a blurb, and what he says is, The Knock at the Door is an inspired, beautifully written chronicle of one of the worst eras in human history. Had such books been written long ago, another Holocaust, which followed 25 years later, might never have happened. That's pretty powerful stuff.
I believe somewhere in your book you talk about how you wondered how come you don't have any uncles and aunts. When did you first start noticing that?
Well, as a child, this really started when I was 6 years old. I remember going to grade school and some kids pushing and shoving me around saying, we hate you, we hate you. And I said, why? Why do you hate me? You're an Armenian, you're an Armenian. Oh, but what did I do? I didn't get it. They said, well, my parents make us eat our spinach because of the starving Armenians. And I thought, but I'm not starving. What are they talking about? I just didn't get it. So it started that early in my life. And even today, people say to me, oh, I know about the Armenians, the starving Armenians, because they were sent out to the desert, and many of them did starve.
What was the rest of the world's reaction while this was happening?
Oh, that's a good question, Mike, because I write in my book when I did my research, because I was curious. I was very curious, and I looked up everything I could find and discovered that the New York Times headlines are, they're in my book, and it says, New York Times, August 18th, 1915, Armenians sent to perish in the desert. August 27th, Turks depopulate towns of Armenia. September 17th, 1915. Mission Board told of Turkish horrors. Correspondents confirmed the reports of the wiping out of Armenians. Front page, New York Times in 1915. So the world was listening. The world was watching and reading about it. I say here, was this genocide? Well, it wouldn't have been called that in 1915 because the word had not yet entered the lexicon. But I thought, what exactly does the word mean? So I wondered. I pulled the dictionary from the shelf. Genocide, the deliberate and systematic extermination of a nation, racial, political, or cultural group. If this was not genocide in 1915, what was it? Deliberate and systematic were the key words for me. So the world did know. They just did nothing about it. And today we know about Darfur. We're not doing anything about it. Rwanda. My heart aches for these poor people who are suffering what my mother did. This is my mother's story, but perhaps we should look at history and we should learn from it. Unfortunately, we don't, and we repeat it.
How many people were killed in the Armenian Genocide?
1 million, up to 1.5 million. And that's an interesting statistic because there weren't that many Armenians, so it was almost 3/4 of the population. There were 6 million Jews who died in the Holocaust, which is also denied today by some people. And I've recently been reading about our Americans. The New Yorker magazine, November 6th, has a wonderful article about Tanir's book, and the last paragraph describes the fact that we Americans came to the Americas, and at that time there were 40 million indigenous people living here. And at the end of it all, by 10, 20 years later, there were only 10 million. That means 30 million Indians, inhabitants of the New World, were either killed by disease, starvation, or outright shooting. How awful is that? And the very last line of that New Yorker says, denial of the Armenian Genocide is a bad thing, but we Americans would have to look in our own backyard too, because maybe we have more in common with the Turks. How about that? That's pretty, for 30 million people.
It might go towards explaining how people can read about places like Darfur and Rwanda and go back to what they were doing.
Exactly. And how can they? I mean, it just goes on. How do we stop it? I don't know. I'm only one voice. I can only tell what happened to my mother. I know she wanted her story told because she said to me, you know, and her later life particularly, she said, Margaret, you've always been asking me, and I've always been telling you bits and pieces, but I realize now that after I'm gone, your children and your grandchildren won't know what happened to their great-grandmother. So she sat down, and we went through all, and I would take her flowers, and every time that I visited her in this home where she lived. And those visits are very poignant because it's two women. There's stuff about me in there. I went to a delinquent center not too long ago to talk to the girls, and I inspired them simply, and they told me I did, because I explained what my mother lived through. And here these girls seem to have no hope. Well, by the end of my talk, they thought, my God, if this woman could live through that, we could survive. And one girl, I donated some books, and she asked me if I would sign it. And I knew I had saved one soul because she wanted me to sign the book. And I wrote it. I said, you will survive this, and my mother's voice is with you. She was so excited. She just cherished that book. I knew that girl would make it out of that penitentiary, and she'd be okay. And I can remember that the Talmud says, if you save one soul in time, you can save the world. Well, I don't think I'll save the world, but I know I saved one soul. And it just made me feel really good. And that in itself tells me my mother would have been really happy about that. She would have loved to have saved somebody. And I felt so good, Mike. I can't tell you. It was a great feeling.
You'd mentioned when we first started that fear was one of those things that could be passed down from generation to generation. And I'm kind of curious about the fear and the divisiveness amongst Armenians over the genocide. I mean, clearly at the time, there were people that chose to willingly integrate, into Turkey. And I have to imagine that has been very divisive amongst Armenians.
Not really. They came back and they just forgot. I mean, they came to America and they didn't say, oh, well, you became a Turk. If you became a Turk, you would survive. My mother never did anyway. I don't know about others. I can only speak for her. But I know my mother would talk about these things when I was a little girl. And my father came in one day, and there I was cowering in a corner listening to these horrible stories. And my mother was crying. They killed them all. They killed them all. And my father said to her very firmly, stop, mortzir. Mortzir is the word in Armenian for forget. You must forget what happened because Margaret's a little girl and you're affecting her life. Well, Mortzi became the mantra of many Armenians who came to this country. And Mike, I think that's part of the problem. And Henry Morgenthau, the grandson of Henry, who is also a friend, said to me, Margaret, did it ever occur to you that when the Armenians all came here, they all wanted to forget what happened to them? They assimilated, they wanted to become Americans, they learned a language, they became citizens, they pretended that that didn't happen, they forgot about it, they said Mortzi. And the Jews, he said, who survived the Holocaust, who came to this country, told one another, remember, remember, never again, remember. He said, do you think that by not remembering and telling one another to forget, they allowed the world to forget too? And I thought that was a really major point. I hadn't thought of that. And I think perhaps that's what happened. If you don't talk about it and you don't remember it and you don't tell it to people and say, look, this is what happened to me, this is what happened to my family, who's going to know about it? The government's certainly not going to make a point about it. Today they deny it as well. But in France and England and in Germany, it's against the law to deny the Armenian genocide. But here in the Americas, we don't say it was a genocide. We pretend that it was just a side effect of the war. Why? Because Turkey is our ally. But they also wouldn't let us fly over their airspace, so I wonder how close we are.
So within Armenia now, what is the situation?
Well, Armenia now is not what was Armenia then. It's the Armenia today that exists was part of Soviet Russia then. And of course, they've broken off and they have their own country. But Armenians in Turkey, even today, don't speak Armenian. And the churches are not open for services. They're maybe museums are closed or open once in a while. So I don't think it's changed too much. I think there are some good, and I also want to read something here because this was so amazing to me. After that May 1st incident, I got a wonderful email, and it said, it's from Serhat Erdogan. I just read news that you had a problem with some Turks at a book signing today. I'm a Turkish guy living in Australia, and I want you to know that there are a lot of Turks and Kurds who know what happened to Armenians. Our hearts go to you and your people. But don't forget, not all the Turks are racist. With my best wishes, may those who died in the genocide rest in peace. He used the G word. And I was so excited. I'm going to find this man. I want to give him a hug because there are good Turks. And hopefully there will be more and more of them who will convince their government to just say, hey, this was part of our past. And then I, too, will have some reconciliation because if you deny something, how can I forgive you for it? I know forgiving is the best thing. But I have this fear, I have this discontent, this as though it happened to me. Those stories filtered down and affected my life. I don't want them to. So I want to be rid of it. I want to find some nice Turks and be friends with them.
Have you found that writing this book has helped to deal with your fears on this?
It has to some extent, yes. I've got some better resolution, but not completely. I'm still afraid. I was in a cab in December in New York, and this taxi driver was Turkish, and I didn't say a word until I got to my destination. I had my hand on the door with the doorman on the other side opening it, and I said, I'm Armenian. And he said, oh, he said, that never happened. Nothing, don't believe what anybody tells you, that never happened. And all I could muster was, as I opened the door to him, I said, yes, it did. It happened to my mother. It's true. And, of course, I ran out. Now I'm thinking, I'm an intelligent adult. How could I feel this way? It sounded very childish. It sounded scared, and I was. So I'm trying to resolve it, Mike, maybe with a little more time. Even though I'm old, I don't know how much time there is, but I'm working on it. I'm working on it. And this email from this guy in Australia really made me feel terrific. And of course, I have Tanner Akçam's a friend too, and he sent me an email that said, Gekmis Olsum, welcome to the club. He has had death threats. He has a bodyguard. And he said, Margaret, when your book comes out, you might need one too. I haven't so far needed one. except for that one day, May 1st. But I didn't feel physically threatened that time. But it was scary to see people jumping up around calling you a liar, and then seeing them being arrested, handcuffed, and taken off to jail. That's pretty scary. So that hasn't happened again. I hope it doesn't, but I'm usually prepared. I usually have a policeman there at a reading, because I don't know. I mean, we have a free country here. Anything can happen.
What is the U.S.'s current position on it? Have they recognized that there was a genocide?
No, they won't recognize the G word. So there is a resolution now before Congress. So if there's anyone out there listening and would like this to become a resolution, call your congressman and say, pass this resolution. It's just a simple thing that says, yeah, there was a genocide. And we can all feel a lot better about it.
Do you happen to know what the number is for that?
I don't know the number of it. I should. I'm so sorry. But it's the Armenian Genocide Resolution, and it has come before Congress, and it's only a few votes away. And if enough people join on, if they go online and write Armenian Resolution in Congress, I'm sure the website will come up. They could probably vote and put their name on a list of, yeah, we think this should happen, or read about it and know and make your own decision about whether you think this should be a resolution or not.
So in a lot of ways, your book is filling in a critical part of history here by getting, the first-person account. There can't be many actual Armenians that survive that left. No,
there are very, very few. And as Publishers Weekly called it, a frank and searing testimony. It brought a face to the history that has been written about broadly with a large brush. And you don't have anyone to single out and say, well, what really physically happened on this day? And I have documented that, and many people are very happy with the way I've done it. I'm very pleased, and I think my mother would be happy. I'm sure Esther's with me right now.
In addition to your book, do you have a website where people can find out more?
Yes, I do. Thanks, Mike. It's www.Margaret, MargaretAhnert.com. And the book is The Knock at the Door. And it's available at Barnes & Noble and Borders and Amazon. And if you go directly to Amazon or Google Margaret Ahnert, Margaret A-H-N-E-R-T, the website will come up, and there's all kinds of information. There's reviews, there's appearances, and all kinds of things you want to know or maybe didn't want to know. They're all there.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. I want to thank you very much for spending time with us this morning.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for having me.
We have just been talking with Margaret Ajemian Ahnert, author of the new book, The Knock at the Door, A Journey Through the Darkness of the Armenian Genocide.